Now that we have built a basic HTML page, we are going to learn how to style that page, how to change the way that it looks in the browser. To do that, we're going to make a new Visual Studio Code project. First, go to your File Explorer. You can see that I have my second repository from the last video here with its files. I also have a new folder called Basic CSS Tutorial that has just one folder, an image folder, with the Cherry Blossom JPEG inside it. We need to create a new folder inside this. Double click, right click to create a new folder, and label this folder CSS. Now we are ready to open the project in Visual Studio Code. So go to Visual Studio Code. You can open the folder, select Basic CSS Tutorial or the label that you gave your second project folder. If we look at the top, with our File Explorer, we can see CSS has nothing in it. Our IMG folder has Cherry Blossom JPEG. The first thing we can do is right-click and make a new file. We'll label this file index.html. To set up a basic web page, just type exclamation point, then press enter. This gives us the basic outline and boilerplate of an HTML page. It has the doc type HTML. It says which language it is. It has a head and a body. We can change the title of this document. Then we can press Command S or Control S to save. If we click Go Live, it will start the server and we can see our web page in the browser. Right now we have no content. It only shows the title, CSS tutorial. Notice it is a local file. Let's add some content in the body. Remember, you just need to type the HTML tag, then press enter. If I press Command S or Control S to save, we now have a heading in our web page. Let's add a paragraph as well. We can type out our own paragraph, but for testing, it's often very efficient to have dummy text go inside. To do that in Visual Studio Code, type lorem, then type how many words you want. This gives us some nice dummy text that is randomly spaced out and will look like a real paragraph in the browser. Okay, so now we have a basic web page. Let's change the way this looks with CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. They're a way of separating the way the content looks from the actual content. The HTML can be considered the content, the CSS is the styling, and the JavaScript, which we'll talk about in future videos, is how the web page works. So the first thing we need to do is talk about how to add CSS to our files. There are three different ways. You can add CSS inline, you can add CSS in a style block in the head, or you can use an external style sheet. Using an external style sheet is the best way. First, let's add styling inline in the document. If you look at the H1 here, I can go inside the tag, put a space, then type style equals quotes. Remember, this is an attribute that has a property and a value pair. If I save that, my level 1 heading is now red. Now it has a background color of yellow. I could also add style to the paragraph. Now my paragraph is styled as well. Let's add another heading to our web page. Notice that this heading does not have that styling. That's because with inline styling, it only affects the element that the style is added to. If I wanted to have this H1 also have that styling, I would have to copy this and paste it down here. This is perfectly acceptable. You can do this. But what if I want to change the background? Now I have to go up to yellow and change it in both sections. This might be fine for a small project, but it's quickly going to get out of control with trying to maintain the code. So there's a slightly better way and then the best way. The other way that you can add CSS to your document is in the head. So right below title, type style, then press enter. This is a style block. We can put CSS directly in this style block. So now I've added CSS to the head, but you might be wondering, why didn't the HTML page change? That's because this style is overridden by the inline styles. So inline styles will always override styles that are coming from the head or a style sheet. So let's delete the inline styles because we don't want to use them. Now if I save the page, notice that both headings are styled. And it's easy to change all of the headings by just changing one line. You can imagine on a large web page that this would be very efficient. The problem is, this is only for this HTML page. What if I want to use this styling on all HTML pages? Well, for that, we need to use an external style sheet. So we need to make a new file. In your File Explorer, right-click New File and type styles.css. Notice that it's at the same level as index.html. We actually want it to be in the CSS folder. Now it's in the CSS folder. We can go ahead and cut this CSS from the head. Press Command X or Control X to cut. Go to the Styles CSS. Press Command V or Control V to paste. Command S or Control S to save. And save the index page. Wait, where'd all the styling go? Well, because it's in a separate file, we have to link to that file and tell the HTML document to use that style sheet. To do that, delete the style block in the head, then type link, enter. Visual Studio Code expects us to link a style sheet because that is best practices. So it tells it what type of link it is, a style sheet. Then we have the hyperlink reference, which will be CSS because it's in the CSS folder. Then we need a slash. And Visual Studio Code already knows that there's style CSS in the folder. So go ahead and click that. Then press Command S or Control S. And look at that. Now we have our styles being added from style CSS. All we have to do is change the styles in that page, then every HTML document that links to that style sheet will be updated. Before we go any further, we want to set our source control. So click on Source Control. We need to initialize our repository. We have all our changes that have not been committed, so we can put a message at the top, initial commit, and click the check mark. Remember, this is only for the local repository. One convenient thing when you're working with HTML and CSS files is to put them side by side so you can see both sets of code at the same time. I'm going to do that. In Visual Studio Code, just grab the tab, then you can drag it around and you get these drop zones. This will put it as full screen. I can put it side by side. I can put it above and below. I like side by side, so I'm going to do that. So on the right, I have my styles.css, and on the left, I have index.html. Let's talk about the syntax of CSS. Syntax is just like grammar or the rules for how to write it. First, we have a selector. In this case, it's an H1, so it's selecting all of the H1s on the page. Then we have a curly braces block. Inside the curly braces, we have a property and a value. The property is color and the value is red. In this case, the property is background color and the value is light yellow. After the property, we need a colon, and after the value, we need a semicolon. It's traditional to put these on separate lines. Notice if I move the curly brace over, then press Command S or Control S, it automatically reformats it in the proper way. If your Visual Studio Code does not do this, make sure you go to the settings, type Format, and make sure Format on Save is installed and you have the Prettier extension installed. You can see the previous video on how to do that. Let's talk about CSS and text because HTML pages are mostly text, and so we need to style that text. We also want to talk about the cascading of CSS. Above H1, let's type a new selector. I'm going to type HTML. This is the root selector, the main top-level selector. If you look in our HTML document over here, HTML is all the way over to the left. Everything is inside the HTML element, even the head and the body. So now I'm selecting everything, curly braces. When we design our web pages, we're going to keep two philosophies in mind. Mobile first, meaning we're going to design for mobile devices first and then make it look good on larger screens. Many of you are probably watching this on a mobile device. So mobile devices are very common, so we're going to design for those first. We are going to make our web pages as accessible as possible. We want all users of the internet, including the vision impaired, to be able to use our websites. To that end, we are going to use relative units instead of pixels for fonts. We want to set the base or root font size to the size that the individual user has selected in their preferences in their browser. To do that, we type font size. This will make the font size 100% of what that user has set. So if the user has set the font size smaller, it will be smaller. If the user has set the font size larger, it will be larger, but it will be that size. Headings and paragraphs and other HTML elements have default sizes made by the browser. We can change those sizes if we want. We can also change the font family. This is a common font stack. What this does is select Arial, and if Arial is not available, it selects Helvetica. And then if Helvetica is not available, it selects a generic sans serif font. So now if you look over here, everything is sans serif. Now that we understand the syntax of CSS, where we have our selector, then our property, then our value, let's talk about CSS specificity. For example, I'm going to type another H1. If I save this, suddenly everything is green. That's because whatever comes last in the document is the most recent change, and that's what the browser will use. For example, if I take this H1, now the green, it sets it to green, but then the computer says, set it to red. Make sure to pay attention to that as you're making your CSS document. There are two more ways to add a selector to your CSS document. Here we're using HTML tags or elements as our selector. We can also use something called a class or an ID. Let's go over to our HTML page, and I'm going to delete this H1. There's a shortcut for typing classes. I can type h1 period dot new color, and it adds this new HTML attribute of a class equals, quote, new color. Nothing has changed here, but now I can select this H1 class and style it with CSS. To select a class, we type period, then the class name. You can name classes anything you want as long as they don't start with a number. Curly braces. Now this becomes blue, and you might be saying, well, of course, because it's down below. Watch what happens if I select this, press Command X or Control X to cut, put it at the very top. It's still blue. That's because this is more specific than the general H1. Because I can put this on the paragraph. So if I go over to the paragraph and I say, and save that, now the paragraph is blue as well, because this is more specific than the default paragraph styling. Let's talk a little bit more about accessibility with colors. We want to make sure that our color selections have good contrast so everyone can read them. It is best practice to set a background color anytime you set a color. So here I set color blue. I should set a contrasting background color. So here I have the background color of white. So anytime you set the foreground color, make sure you set a background color that is high contrast. If you want to know if your background color and foreground color have enough contrast, there are plenty of tools on the internet. Here we have blue and white, and it all passes. If I click a different color, now it has a contrast ratio of 1.41. So this is very hard to read, but maybe we can give it a darker color to see if it will work. Now we're back up to a high contrast ratio, and we get passes for accessibility. So make sure that you always set the color and the background color together, and it has a high enough contrast ratio. Now look up here, you see these strange numbers. These are hexadecimals, a base 16 counting system that is used for color identification. We can use these in CSS also. You may notice these from Photoshop or other graphics programs. So if I copy this, Command C or Control C, I can paste this into my CSS document and it will become that color. Now you can see why we have rules about setting the color and the background color at the same time. This is very hard to see. So I will go back and I will get the background color. And now it has enough contrast for me to see. There are all kinds of hexadecimal colors, and there are a limited amount of named CSS colors. So these general generic colors, these will work. There'll be lots of different names that you can type in. You can look up all the different ones. So magenta, and then it also conveniently gives you the hexadecimal. Now notice here, this is red, green, blue, RGB. We'll talk about RGB color values, but FF is the highest number. F is like 16 in hexadecimal. So this is 2 16s, then 00. For example, if I wanted to make red, I can put a hashtag FF0000. Save that, and it will be red because this is red. So I'm saying give it all the value of red, then no green and no blue. I could also change this and put the FF in the middle, and this will give it that bright green. This is the same green that you would use for chroma keying a green screen. And if I wanted it to be all blue, but there's no need to remember hexadecimals. You may remember a couple common ones, like for example, 00 will be black and FFFFF will be white. Those ones are usually remembered. And there's a shortcut for those. If it's all the same, you can just type hexadecimal 3 characters, or if you want it to be black. So this will be a very common declaration, a foreground color of black and a background color of white. We can also use RGB values to select colors in CSS. So to do that, we'll add another color declaration, color. Then we write RGB. And now we use a 0 to 255 scale. So again, it's RGB. So if I wanted it to be red, I type 255, then 0, close parentheses. If I save that, so if you ever forget semicolon, your CSS won't work. So I need a semicolon at the end there. RGB 25500. If I want to make it blue. So this is convenient. For example, if someone gives you an RGB color value and you want to use it in your project, you can use it this way. We can also add transparency. So if I wanted to have it slightly transparent, I can type RGBA with the A being the alpha channel. So now I need 4 characters. And then I have a decimal percentage. 1 would be 100% opaque. 0 would be 100% transparent. So if I go 0.3, usually it wants the 0 in front. Now you can see that this is transparent. Be careful with that so you still have enough contrast. And notice that each of these is overridden. First we say, make the color black. Then we say, make the color blue. Then we say, make the color 30% transparent blue. So make sure you pay attention to the order that these are in. If I put this on top, this is the last color declaration, so that's the one that takes priority. In CSS, sometimes you want to make notes to yourself. Just like in HTML, you can make comments. The syntax for a comment is slash, then star. You put a slash, then star. This is a comment, star, then slash. So this will not have any effect on your document, but it's great for adding notes to yourself. For example, if you are just starting out with CSS and you want to remember what this A is, you could put a comment to yourself. So now we have this little note to ourselves, so we always remember that this A is the alpha channel. So comments are really convenient for making notes to yourself and documenting your code. In CSS, everything starts with the content. The content is the heading or the paragraph or the image or the link or the list. Then we have what is called the CSS box model. There's the standard box model. And if we go to the Mozilla Developer Network, we can see the box model here. The box model starts with the content, right? So that's the innermost box. Then we have padding. Padding adds extra space around the content. Then we can add a border, and around that border we can add a margin. A margin is the space in between pieces of content. Padding is the space in between the content and the border. Let's go ahead and make a container in our HTML. So let's go below the heading and let's type section. And then we're going to use the shorthand. So we'll type period. So here we have a section with a class standard box. Let's add some content inside. So type P. And if I go back to our web page, we have just a container. Remember, containers don't do anything. They just are structural containers that we can style. And we have a paragraph that says standard box model. Let's go ahead and copy all of this and change the class name to the border box model. So now we have two paragraphs that have different classes, but right now they just have default styling. Let's add a class to our CSS sheet. So we have standard box, and let's give it a background color. So now it has a background color of light pink. Let's give it a width of 300 pixels. Let's copy this, and we'll make this one border box. Now we have both of these are the same. They have the same styling. This is 300 pixels. Let's start to add some padding and border to our standard box to see how the standard box model works. If I type padding, 30 pixels of padding, now around the standard box model, I have 30 pixels in every direction. And notice, suddenly the box has gotten bigger. Remember, this is still 300 pixels, but the standard box is now bigger. Let's add a border. For a border, we type three different selectors. First, we type how thick it will be. Then we type what type it is, and then its color. So let's make a border solid. So now we have a green-yellow border around our standard box. Notice that now the box is even bigger because it added the padding and the border to its size. And lastly, let's add a margin of 30 pixels. Now you can see how the margin has expanded in all the directions around the box. Now it has a 30 pixel margin around it. This is much larger than 300 pixels. This is 300 pixels. Here we have 30 pixels for the margin, plus 20 pixels for the border. So now we're up to 100 pixels, plus padding, that's 160 pixels, plus the width, that's 300 pixels. So watch, if I change this to 460 pixels, it's the same as this whole box. So the standard box model adds everything and increases the total size. Now let's look at the border box model. I've changed this back to 300 pixels. I'm just going to copy these settings so they're exactly the same. Okay, so now we have two boxes, but I'm going to change the display style of the border box. Watch what happens when I save this. The box stays the same size. So it still has the margin on the outside, but the padding and the border are inside the box. This can be very helpful when you're trying to lay out a page and you want to know what size an element is. It's pretty standard to set things as border box. And we can do that with a universal selector in CSS. Go to the top of your CSS file, type star. Star means everything, then curly braces. And then we can type box sizing border box. Now the standard box model is also the right size. If you just use star, curly braces, box sizing, border box, for most projects, you'll be fine. But it's a good idea and best practice to add a couple other selectors. So these are pseudo class selectors. Don't worry about what those are right now. Instead of using just the star, use this as your box sizing declaration. To use even more best practice code, we can type inherit. So we're telling all the elements to inherit the box sizing. And where do they inherit it from? From the root element. So from the root element, the HTML is the root element. It sets the box sizing as border box. Then we're saying everything should inherit that property from HTML. Now we can delete this. For example, if we wanted the standard box to display standard, we can have this be content box. Content box is the default box sizing style. Okay, now that we understand how the box model in CSS works, let's talk a bit more about styling text. We can give everything a default line height. As you look here, notice in the paragraph we have a bit more spacing, makes it a little bit easier to read. We did this with a root relative unit, so an RM, a rem, that's relative from the root. So it's saying 1.5 of the default font size, right? So what is the default font size? Well, 100%. 100% of what? 100% of what the user of the browser has set their font size. Most people have not changed their font size, but we want to respect those users who have changed it. So this is the best way to do that. Then if you want your headings to be larger, we can change their font size. So if you make the font size 3 rem, now notice that they're bigger. But what's going on with this? This is all busting out of its line. That's because we set the default line height as 1.5, and that's great. But what we want to do is have this header have a different line height that's at least large enough for its text. So on the header, we can add a new declaration. 3 rem will make it exactly that height, or if you want it to be a little bit. These are all choices that you can make based on what design that you want. Let's add a paragraph selector. We set the default font family, but what if we want a different family for the paragraphs? Here I've selected a monospace font for the paragraphs. Now everything has changed. We can also change the font weight. Now everything in the paragraphs is bold. We can make everything lighter. We can also make it normal, which is the default. We can change the letter spacing. So now the letters are spaced much farther apart. We can use a negative value, so now everything is smashed up together. You wouldn't want to do this for legibility, but perhaps there's some design element that you want to have overlapping text for typographical reasons in your design. You can use letter spacing for that. You can also have word spacing. So now the words are spaced farther apart. So you can use these for whatever you want. To show you how comments work, let's say I don't want this to be affected. I can comment out just that line, and if I save this, the letter spacing goes away. When we added these classes, I mentioned that there's also IDs that you can use. IDs are very specific, and you can only have one of each type of ID on your HTML page. And for the most part, when you're starting out in CSS, it's best to only use classes because IDs have much more specificity than classes. And so sometimes it can be difficult to debug why something isn't changing. To demonstrate that, let's add an ID to our heading at the top. To add an ID, go inside the tag, type ID, the one. So this is the one. I'm going to go all the way up to the top here. To write a class, we write the hash mark. And notice, even though that this is up here, it also has the new color class, and the new color class is below. It automatically gets overridden by the ID because this is very specific. Until you definitely need to use an ID in your design or your web page for functionality, it's best to learn by just using classes. Let's talk a bit more about borders and padding and margins. There's a great shorthand. So for example, in this border box, let's change the border to be different. So I could just have it be on the top. And now I only have border on the top. What if I wanted it to be on the bottom? I could have it on the bottom. What if I wanted a different border on the top and bottom? Now I have different sizes of the border. And I can do this for border right and border left. With the border, you need to type out border top, border right, border bottom. But with padding, it's different. So we can have padding right with 300 pixels. So now it's pushed everything over. We can have different padding. Instead of 30 pixels all the way around, we can change that. We can make this in one single declaration. So we can go top, bottom, right, left. Think of the top as 12 o'clock, right as 3 o'clock, bottom as 6 o'clock, and left as 9 o'clock. So we can have 10 pixels at the top. Then we can have 20 pixels, then 30 pixels on the bottom. and then again 20 pixels on the left. So now it has the padding based on the rules that we set. This is the same as typing padding top, right, bottom, and left separately. You can use whichever notation you want, but sometimes this notation is a lot shorter and easier to use. Before we move forward, let's talk about keeping our CSS dry. Dry is a term from coding that means do not repeat yourself. So here, if you look at standard box and border box, we have lots of the same code repeated. So we could make a new class called box. Inside this, we could put everything that is the same. So we could copy all these. We can delete the background color out of border box, the width, the padding. Now the borders are different, but let's say we wanted to keep the borders the same. And we'll leave the padding here because this is something that we've added. And if I save that, notice all the styling has gone away. But what we can do is add multiple classes. This is very convenient, and it is a way for you to have your code be much smaller. So here I can just say both of these have the class of box. So they're both boxes, and I have this generic box styling. And then I can style my individual boxes differently because this is the standard box and this is the border box. So this is a great way of using multiple CSS classes and having your code be much shorter and more efficient. Notice that I have my new color class up here. Generally, we want to make our declarations for our HTML elements first, then add our classes. So I'm going to move this down to the bottom. This is just a way of organizing your code. We can also add things to the body. So if I type body, this is a selector, and I can add a background color to the body. And now notice the entire background is light gray. Now you might not like this color being different. Well, we could change that to light gray as well. This is another heading. And if we look at another heading, that's the default heading style. So we go to H1 and then we can change this to, oh, that's right. We have two. So this can help you out. So normally you don't want to have this. So I'm going to delete this second heading declaration. So we only have one. Okay, so now our heading is back to green. But look here. If I open this up, wow, that gets really hard to read. Everything gets so wide. You're probably used to seeing web pages stay centered on the page. Remember, we're designing for mobile first, so this looks fine. If this was on a cell phone, everything would be stacked up. I probably would change the width of my boxes here. But if we want to center something on the page, we can do that very easily with some styling on the body. We can give the body a max width. So let's give it a max width of, say, 1000 pixels. So now if I drag this out, notice that it only gets as wide as 1000 pixels, which is fine, but it's still way over here on the left, right? So I kind of would like that to be centered in the browser. Well, we can put a margin on the body. We can say the top and bottom margin be 0, and the left and right margin be auto. Now this will automatically center our web page. See how no matter how wide I make browser window, the web page stays in the center. So this is a pretty standard way of centering your web content. And notice it allows us still to be centered here on our mobile friendly design. We can add individual margins to our headings here. So let's add a margin. Our headings are moved over just a bit, and we can do the same thing to our paragraph. So now our paragraph also has a margin. Let's add a link to our page. To add a link, type A, enter, then type the hyperlink reference of where the link will go. Let's type page2.html. We don't have a page 2, but here we go. We have a link. If you look right here, there's our page 2 link, and it has the default HTML styling for links. Well, we can change that in CSS. So let's go up to where our default tags are. There are 6 selectors we can use for links. If we type A, this selects everything about a link, all the different states, because a link can have different states such as visited, focus, hover, or active. So let's just style the general A. For example, we could say that we don't want them to have an underline. So we could say, and if we look here, now our link doesn't have an underline. It's best practice to leave an underline there for accessibility, but if for some reason in your design you don't want one, it's okay to take that off. But make sure you give some indication, either with a color change, a size change, or a hover state that lets your users know that it's a link. So let's talk about the different states of links. Then we can do a visited. If I went to page two, let's go ahead and make a page two. So if I go over to my file explorer here and I right click new file and I say page HTML, here's page two, and I'm just going to command A or control A, command C or control C to copy. And then I'm just going to paste everything in page two. So now we have a page two. And just so we know that we're on page two, I will type page two at the very top heading. And then I'm going to save that and close it. So if I click on page two, I go to it. If I go back in my browser, this doesn't change. This is a private tab. So a private tab won't remember your visited state. But if you've ever seen a purple link, that's the visited state. So sometimes you want the visited state to be different. Sometimes you want it to stay the same. If people have a private tab, they may not see that visited state. But we can give it a color. We want to set a background color to make sure it's accessible with enough contrast. We can do a hover. This is what happens when you're over the link. So let's do color and copy this hexadecimal color here. If we put this here, now we don't have to keep changing the background color. We don't have to keep declaring the background color because now all of the A states have this background color light gray. Now, if you look, if I save this, and if I hover over page two, you can see it changes to that color. And then the last one you will likely use often is A active. That is when I click on the link. You see how it turns red when it is active? And a lot of times what you can do is have A hover change the background color as well. So we can say, now when I hover over it, it has this background color. When I hover over it, it also gets the underline. There's lots of ways that you can style links. And when we talk about page layout with CSS in future videos, we'll talk about how to style links for a menu or other ways that you may want to do that. Now let's add an image to our page. There's multiple ways that you can add an image. In HTML, there's only one way we can add an image to the document. So let's go ahead and do that. IMG, enter. And then our source, where is the image coming from? So if I click on my file manager, where is my image? Well, it's in the folder image, and it's called Cherry Blossom. So here I want to type IMG, then slash, and Visual Studio Code already finds that Cherry Blossom is in there. If I had multiple images, I'd have to pick which one, but it knows that that's the only one. And then remember, we always want to type in the alt tag. The alt tag should be a brief but accurate description of the image. This alt tag will be used for screen readers and for browsers if for some reason the image does not display. So this is good for accessibility and usability. So make sure to always add your alt tag. And then if I've saved that and I reload the page, and now it has the cherry blossom. If you remember from the previous video with HTML, we fixed this problem. If you notice here, the rest of the page is being nice and centered, but what is going on with these cherry blossoms? They are so huge, right? It's so big. We can make this image responsive. To do that, we go up to the top where we're putting our code for HTML selectors, type IMG, then brackets. And what we want to do is have the width be 100% of the container. So if I go width 100%, that means it'll be as wide as the container. What container is it in? Well, it's in the body right here, see? And what did we put for the body? Well, we said the body has a max width of 1000 pixels. So it will be a maximum width of 1000. Then we want the height to be automatic. This will preserve the aspect ratio. So now if I look here, I can see my image and it's all perfectly fit in on a mobile device. But then when I go to a desktop size, it will be centered in the page. We'll talk more about mobile queries and setting up our pages for tablets and phones and desktop computers and super big screens in a future video about layout. But for now, this will make your images responsive for what size screen that people are using. There's one thing we need to add to this tag though. It won't be immediately obvious unless I add another image. To do that, I'm just going to copy this image tag and then paste it below. And so if you look, right here we have some space in between these images, which is fine, but generally you want to control your design. So if you want to have space in between the images, you want to say, I want space. You don't want just default space. That's because images are inline elements. We have two types of elements in CSS, inline and block elements. Inline elements are links, images, and things like that that will flow inline with the text. Block level elements are paragraphs, headings, things that will start a new line and go all the way across the page. What we can do with the images, instead of having them be inline elements, we can change their display mode. And now there's no space in between. Of course, we can add our own space if I wanted to have one rem of space below them. I can add padding or a margin, whatever I chose. We want to be in control of the design. I made a comment to remind myself what that is doing. So that makes my images responsive. There's one other way that you can add images in CSS. You can add them as a background image. Let's add the same image as a background image to the body. And now you can see that this cherry blossom image is fully filling the background. Now this is getting a little busy, but you can see that you can have things floating on top of the background, which is really great. I'm going to show you another way that you can add an image as a background in CSS. To do that, first I'm going to go to my File Explorer. And you can see here I have gradient.png. This is a simple gradient that I made in Photoshop. It is 5,000 pixels wide by 1 pixel tall. So if I look at this, this is very skinny gradient. First, I need to move that into my image folder. Here it is in the image folder now. If we go back to Visual Studio Code, instead of using cherryblossom.jpg as our background image, I'm going to use gradient. And if I save that, I now have my gradient on the page. The gradient looks great, but notice that over here I only have the blue on one side. Well, I can add another position to that. Now I'll have this pink or magenta color when it's small, but when I zoom out, I'll have this nice gradient that is perfectly even on both sides. Now, the default for a background image is to repeat in the vertical way, but we could change that. There are 3 different declarations. Background repeat, we could say no repeat. If I save that, the gradient is only at the very, very, very top, 1 pixel. I could say repeat X. So if I had a super wide monitor or I had a vertical gradient, that would be great. But what we want is repeat Y, which repeats it in the vertical direction. Before we close out this tutorial, let's go back to our source code. As you can see, we have a number of notifications here. So what we want to do is commit these changes. So what did we do? We updated the CSS and added page 2. I click check mark. Now we want to add them to GitHub. So click here. And then at the top, it's going to ask us if we want to publish to our GitHub private repository. And yes, we do. So now it is published to GitHub. Then if we go to GitHub, let's open up a new tab. Notice now we have 3 repositories. So click on the basic CSS tutorial. Notice that this one is still private because that's the default setting, is to have your repository be private. And here are all our files that we've uploaded, and it has our latest commit message. Go to Settings. Down at the bottom in the danger zone, click on Change Visibility. Click Make Public. Type in the name of the repository, and then click I understand. Now this is a public repository, meaning anyone can see it on the internet. Then scroll down. And for the source for GitHub Pages, select the master branch, save. And it says our site is ready to be published. It's not there yet, but very soon it will be after you refresh your browser a few times. But go back to GitHub, and we want to click on one last thing. If you look right here, we want to make sure we click on Enforce HTTPS. If you want to know how to set up HTTPS with GitHub and Namecheap, watch the previous video on that topic. All right, our site is published. So now if I go to it, here it is on the web. Now you might notice that the background is not here. Because we put a slash in our CSS folder looking for the project root, it's trying to look at the root directory of GitHub where the image is not. So what we want to do is go back to our project. In order to get our background image to show on our GitHub pages on the internet, we need to use a relative link. Here, this slash works for our project root folder for the live server in Visual Studio Code, but this is looking for the root directory of the GitHub website. This isn't in the root directory of GitHub. So what we need to do is say, go one directory up from where we are. Where we are is index.html, and then go to image gradient.png. If I save this, go to source control, click the check mark to commit your changes, sync with GitHub. Now with the two dots making it a relative link, our gradient works on GitHub pages. So this is a basic intro to CSS. There's much more to cover. Highly recommend exploring the Mozilla Developer Network documents on CSS. They have all kinds of things that you can reference and get examples for. This is a go-to resources for finding best practices of coding on the web. In the next tutorials, we'll talk about actual layout of web pages with CSS using Flexbox and CSS Grid. And then finally, we're going to put it all together and lay out an artist portfolio that we can add images and style and have look really good on the page.